Okay, so just so you know, my green screen is temporarily out of commission, so there will not be a talking head on this video. It'll be purely screen share, headless. Not from a technology perspective. We're not going to talk about headless. We're going to talk about performance profiling. Specifically, I'll be introducing two products that I like to use for performance profiling, for at least giving me general direction and helping me decide where to focus my energies when I'm trying to track down performance issues. We're going to talk about Netling and SQL Profiler, and maybe a little more at the end. One thing I forget to mention, and I know I forget to mention it because I've already recorded the screen share part of this, is that the tools I use in this video, I use a lot to diagnose Optimizely CMS websites, but they are not specific to Optimizely CMS. They're pretty useful for any web technology, especially any web technology that talks to Microsoft SQL Server. So keep that in mind as you watch and enjoy. Enjoy without my face. All right, so today I just want to cover a couple of basic tools to sort of get you into performance profiling and SQL profiling. This is sort of loosely inspired by a real issue we had with a real client where their site would become kind of sluggish and would have performance issues during certain types of scans. And so we tracked down the issue, we fixed it, and I kind of want to walk through the process I used to get there. Now, I want to be clear, this is going to be the briefest of introductions to performance profiling because there are many excellent tools. I'm not even going to use the Visual Studio Profiler. I just want to give you sort of that starting point and the couple tools that I like to use. So let's get into it. So you may remember this site. This is the Optimizely from Scratch website we've been building. I'm using this as my demo site, and I've added some code to it that's not super well written, just as a demonstration. And what I want to do to start is to sort of simulate a load test, but I want to just do it locally because I just want to get a baseline of where we're at. And because this site is so simple and does so little, and it is just very little code in it, it's going to be a little tricky to test because it's not doing very much. And so the speed that we're going to get out of this is going to be insane, but it's not going to be what you would see maybe on a server or more specifically on a site that is actually doing real work. So the first tool I want to talk about is Netling. That's Netling, Netling. I find it kind of oddly hard to pronounce, effectively. Netling allows me to simulate a load test sort of locally. So it basically gives me the option here. I can set however many threads I want to run. So I'm going to do 12 threads because I have 12 cores, and we'll just do one thread per core. Each one of those threads is going to try to request whatever URL I put here as quickly as possible and as many times as possible for 10 seconds. So I'm going to pop in the home page, but before I do that, there's a couple things I need to make sure I've done. To do sort of a proper load test, this needs to be in release mode, which it is. And when I run it, I need to run it without a debugger. So Control F5, and it will execute without a debugger. The other thing I need to do is actually go to the page I'm going to visit, and I'm just going to refresh it a few times to make sure all the caches and stuff are warmed up, because I don't really want to profile the page if it hasn't been already accessed once before, because then I just get a bunch of compilation time that isn't really relevant. Having done all that, I'm going to go ahead and hit run. Again, it's going to make as many requests per second as it can, which is going to be significant on this site, and it collects some metrics while it's running that. So as you can see, this site manages about 11,500 requests per second. Again, because it's not doing any work, you're probably not going to see this on a lot of sites because most sites have, navigation and stuff that they pull in. But this is a good sort of baseline. I'm going to set this as my baseline. And what that does is I can run it again and compare against the baseline. So my baseline is 11,500 requests per second. I'm going to try the articles pages. So I'm going to go ahead and hit the articles page, refresh a couple times, and let's paste that URL in and run exactly the same test and see how it compares to the home page. There we go. And so now we're down to 5,000 requests per second. The median response time is now 2 milliseconds, which is still insanely fast, but significantly higher than the baseline of 0.9 milliseconds per request. So obviously this page is quite a bit slower. It's also doing stuff, so that explains why. But in a real world scenario, you would be looking for something with a much bigger difference. But this at least gives me an indication that, wow, this page is quite a bit slower than the home page. So I can start diving into why that is. And to do that, I want to introduce the other profiling tool that I really like, which is SQL Profiler. So I'm going to go ahead and start up SQL Server Profiler. This is version 18. I think 19 maybe is the latest version at this point. It doesn't really matter. I have both on my other machine, and they are functionally identical as far as I can tell. So when you get into SQL Profiler, it does not hold your hand at all, and it can be a little intimidating to look at. But here's the important points that you need to know. First of all, you need to go up to this button in the top left and click New Trace. And then you'll be prompted to connect to a server. Obviously, I'm going to connect to my local server. And then the next screen here, the important thing that you're going to want to do is go to Event Selection. So if I just run this with all the default events selected, I'm going to get a ton of information, but most of it is going to be noise. And just to show you what that looks like, I'm going to go ahead and run it. I'm going to start my site, but I'm actually going to switch back to debug mode at this point. I don't really need to do the release stuff. It's not important because I'm not measuring speed. What I'm looking for is what SQL calls are happening. So I'm going to go ahead and start this. I'm going to reload that home page. And you're going to see a whole bunch of stuff in here. And I'm going to pause this. We don't need to look at all of this. But this is kind of like all the requests that happen when your site is booting up. It needs to load a ton of information. But there's just a bunch of stuff like this audit login, audit logout. I don't need to see this, at least for what I'm doing at this moment. All I really care about is what SQL calls are happening. And the SQL calls are, for the most part, all happening in this RPC completed. So I'm going to close this trace. I'm going to start a new trace. This time I'm going to go into my event selection. Again, for right now, I don't care about logging in and logging out. I also don't care about existing sessions. The SQL batch completed can be useful sometimes, but I haven't found it super useful for Optimizely sites. And so it leaves me with RPC completed. It's unchecked text data, which is the one field I actually want. So a lot of times I'll just uncheck it and then check this. The text data field will tell me what SQL command is actually being executed. And that can be really helpful if you see a SQL call and you have no idea why is something calling SQL. Sometimes the call itself can give you some information. So I'm going to run this, and then I'm actually going to stop the site and start it over so that I can see that same boot up information again. So as you can see, the site gets pretty chatty when you first boot it up. If I hit this eraser button, it'll clear everything out of the current trace, but keep the trace running. And if I come back to the home page and refresh, it's not making any requests. And that's because the cache is effective. We've gotten everything we need to render the home page. I haven't published any pages, so it's not going to talk to the database. Now, if I go into edit mode and refresh, it's going to talk to the database because it's bypassing the cache. And that's what we want. This is exactly the perfect behavior that we want. So this can actually be kind of handy to run in tandem with Netling. So if I open up the home page and just do the same process again and hit the home page. So not only am I gathering some not as useful metrics here because I'm running in debug mode, but also I'll see any SQL calls happening here. So there's not a ton of SQL calls. And actually you can see running in debug mode has a significant effect on the performance of the site. We're down to 2,000 requests per second, but I don't really care. I really just want to generate a bunch of traffic to see what happens with the SQL calls. I'm going to go to that articles page that was kind of slow. So again, the first time I load the page, you're going to see a bunch of chattiness because the cache is cold. No big deal. Let me just clear that, reload the page. I can already see as I hit the page reload, it's making a lot of requests relative to the home page. I can make it really really apparent if I run this in Netling. And you can just watch this thing fill up. So we sustained about 1,600 requests per second, and that came out to be 63,000 requests to the database. And not all of these are really that important, like these reset connections one are not super important at this point. But it definitely points to this page as being pretty chatty compared to what we want. The ideal thing is that once a page has been loaded, it should never talk to the database again until the cache is cleared or expired. So let's take a look. I'm going to close Netling. We don't really need it at the moment. Bring up the profiler again. Let's just take a look at this page. If I hit it once, it makes 2 calls to the database, and each call is basically net page list all. So let's take a look and see if we can figure out where that's coming from. So I know that this page here, this articles page, is a general page. And so probably the first place I would look is the general page controller. And I know there's some code here, and this code is doing some stuff. I also just know that this code isn't actually having any effect. I could just remove this code. This was just some example code to show how you load things out of the content area. But again, I'm not actually doing any work. I'll just remove that for now. So I'm sure that that's not the issue, but I do know that there's a block on this page, which is a related, I think it's called related content block. Let's look. Related pages block. And that has a controller too. And so I want to kind of walk through what it would look like to test that. So I'm going to start the site again. Let's refresh this. I'm going to clear the trace because it's doing all that initial loading that I don't care about. Let's set a breakpoint and reload. Now what's interesting is you can step through, and you might expect that when I hit a point that calls the database, it's going to show up here. And that's true, but the way this code is written, it's sort of not going to happen. So I've stepped through this entire controller, and it hasn't made any calls to the database. So it feels like, oh, obviously that's not the problem. Yet it still makes 2 calls to the database. So where is the problem? Well, let's take a look at the view. So we have the related pages block here, and I'm going to go ahead and set a breakpoint. Let's reload the page. We hit the breakpoint in the controller. Again, nothing happens in the database. Keep going. My view model, the related pages got set in the controller. So it actually got put here. If I go into my view model, you can see it's just a getter. There's no logic in the view model. And yet, when I call .any, it makes a request. In fact, it's calling this net page list all, which is a little weird. And then I go into my for each loop and net page list all again. So that gives me a big clue. If I jump back into my controller, I've got this get descendants. Let's put a breakpoint in here. Reload the page. Now get descendants actually gets called right here, except my breakpoint didn't get hit. So we keep going. Now we're in the view. Now it gets hit. And that's because this get descendants is using the yield return. And so it's sort of creating an IEnumerable. It's actually creating an enumerator. The compiler is building an enumerator for me. And because it's an enumerator, it's being called in a lazy way. And so get descendants doesn't actually get called until you try to iterate the results of this function, which doesn't happen until the view. And so this is a way that database calls can sort of get hidden in the view. And you might think it's not happening in the controller, but it actually sort of, the code is in the controller, but it doesn't get executed until it's in the view. So if I clear this, we're going to call the get descendants. That calls the net page list all. Now, I was always under the impression that everything that is in ContentLoader, which is defined up here as just IContentLoader, is cached. And so you can just call that anytime, anywhere, any place you want. That does not seem to be the case with get descendants. And I've seen differing opinions about whether or not get descendants should be cached, but it definitely is not. So don't think that you can call get descendants whenever you feel like. If you're calling this, you should either be like in a scheduled job or be caching it yourself or just not using it. In fact, what you should be doing is calling this from some kind of content index. So anyway, I can iterate through this, and you can see it loads the content, and because it's using try-get is cached, so it's not calling the database. It's yielding these pages. They are going through all the filtering, and so you kind of see that lazy execution. Anyway, I will just continue, and we call it again. Now let me see if I can see where this is being called from. So it's coming from here. Here's the second place where it gets iterated, is when I actually do the for each. And so anytime you do .any, .count, or you do for each, you're iterating the enumerable. And if it's a lazy enumerable like this, then it will actually get executed at that time. So how do we fix this? Well, like I said, you probably should have some caching here. The other thing we could do is drop in a toList. So let me stop this. I think the compilers might complain about this, maybe not. Nope, it inferred that related content is IEnumerable and didn't get confused. So if I run this again, we're still going to have a little bit of chattiness. I'm going to just get rid of all my breakpoints. Let's clear that. Let's refresh it. Now it's calling it once. And you can ignore these. These are probably like some scheduled job or something. There's a little bit of noise. But every time I refresh the page, it calls once. And that's because when I do this .toList, that iterates the list and then stores the result as an iList. And so all the filtering will be on the iList instead of that lazy function. So .any will be on iList. And when you iterate an iList, it's, the results are already materialized. So there you have it, a very brief introduction to Netling and SQL Server Profiler. And I think these are some very useful tools to have in your pocket. And one thing to keep in mind is that the SQL Server that runs on your local machine is a whole lot faster than the SQL Server that runs on the server. Now, I don't mean that your machine is faster than the server, but the server is handling a very different load from your local machine. And so it's easy to write code that works perfectly well on my machine and then falls apart once it's in a hosted environment. And so tools like SQL Server Profiler can help you out. So I, for one, really like SQL Server Profiler. But what if we could automate it? Maybe in the next video. Thanks for watching, and I hope you found this useful.